Cops showed up because I said no to my HOA president. She stood on my porch with two strangers, demanding I let them inside my house. I thought I was being safe. She called me difficult, then dialed 911. But when the sirens arrived, they weren't here for me. This is how my fresh start in Oakwood Hills exploded, and why you never let bullies weaponize the rules. I'm Gavin Cole. Moving to Oakwood Hills was supposed to be my fresh start. I make wooden signs for a living. You know those hand-carved directory boards you see at schools, historic buildings, that sort of thing. I remember the first time I carved anything real. My grandfather stood over my shoulder, silently nodding as I traced the letter A into a scrap of pine. He didn't say much, but when I got it right, he tapped the wood and said, "Now it means something." That's when I knew this was more than a trade. It was family. Still, even as I signed the closing papers, I had this tiny voice in my head whispering, "Don't forget to read the fine print." I didn't. I just didn't expect it to bite this hard. After years of apartment living, I finally had enough saved for a small house in what looked like a quiet neighborhood. The realtor mentioned something about an HOA, but honestly, I wasn't paying much attention. I figured it would be the usual stuff. Keep your lawn neat. Don't paint your house neon pink. Basic common sense rules. Looking back, I should have known better when the contract was thicker than my lease agreement. Little did I know, those 83 pages held the key to my survival and Diana's downfall. The moving truck hadn't even finished unloading when she appeared. Diana Mallerie marched up my driveway like she owned it. "Welcome to Oakwood Hills," she announced, already flipping open a binder thicker than my lease. "Let's discuss your compliance." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. This wasn't a welcome. It was an inspection. She was probably in her mid-40s, wearing a crisp white blazer that screamed former corporate executive, carrying a leather folder that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a week. Her grip could probably crush walnuts when I shook her hand, and I invited her in for coffee, biggest mistake of my day, possibly my year. Diana spread out what looked like a small library across my kitchen table. Color charts for acceptable house paint, diagrams showing proper lawn maintenance, specifications for mailbox heights, flower bed borders, even the acceptable wattage for porch lights. I swear I thought she was kidding. Who catalogs porch light wattage like it's national security? "Now I notice you have a pickup truck," she said, flipping through her papers like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "That's perfectly fine, of course, but just be aware that commercial vehicles can't be parked on the street after 6 p.m. Then she spotted my workshop set up in the garage. I had my carving tools laid out, a half-finished sign for the local elementary school propped against the workbench. Diana's eyes lit up like she'd found gold. "Oh, you do woodworking? How quaint." Now, I should mention that any business signage needs to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. She pulled out what looked like a magnifying glass and actually started examining my work. This lettering appears to be slightly off standard. The serif height is inconsistent with our approved typography guidelines. I clenched my teeth. I'd carved that sign with my own hands, hours bent over it, and she dismissed it like it was some crooked Etsy knockoff. I didn't say what I was thinking. I still needed to survive here. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was about control. Diana wasn't just the HOA president. She was the self-appointed queen of Oakwood Hills, and she wanted to make sure I knew exactly where I stood in her kingdom. After she left, I sat in my empty living room surrounded by moving boxes and read through the welcome packet. 47 pages of rules covering everything from the exact shade of white allowed for fence paint to the specific species of grass permitted in front yards. There were regulations about wind chimes, bird feeders, even the direction you could point your garbage cans. That evening, I took a walk. Every hedge trimmed at the same height, porch lights the exact same wattage. It wasn't peace, it was conformity. I started to wonder if I'd moved into a museum, not a neighborhood. That first night, I got my first taste of Diana's enforcement style. A formal letter slipped under my door while I was sleeping, typed on official HOA letterhead. "Dear Mr. Cole, it has come to our attention that your workshop lighting exceeds the permitted lumens for residential garage use. Please adjust accordingly within 72 hours or face a $50 daily fine." The next morning, I was loading lumber into my truck when Mrs. Patterson from next door approached me. She was maybe 70 with gray hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen plenty of neighborhood drama. "You met Diana yet?" she asked, glancing around like she was checking for surveillance. When I nodded, she shook her head sympathetically. "This woman fined us last month for hanging our flag 12 hours too long on Memorial Day. Just be careful, okay? She's got it out for anyone who doesn't fall in line immediately." By the next morning, a new note had been taped to my mailbox. "Unapproved cedar finish may not meet visual cohesion standards. Review pending." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a signature. Standing there in my driveway, holding Diana's ridiculous letter about workshop lighting, and now this note about my mailbox, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be another neighbor living in fear of the HOA president. Diana Mallerie might think she ran this neighborhood, but she was about to learn that I didn't scare easily. Diana's next move came exactly 72 hours later, like clockwork. I deliberately left my workshop light exactly as it was just to see what would happen. The answer arrived in my mailbox Tuesday morning. Another official letter, this time threatening a lien against my property if I didn't comply within 48 hours. A lien? Over a work lamp? I sat in my truck reading this masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach and realized Diana wasn't just power-hungry. She was absolutely ruthless. But two could play the rules game, and I had an advantage Diana didn't know about. Before becoming a full-time woodcarver, I'd spent 3 years doing custom signage for government buildings, city halls, courthouses, DMV offices, places where you learn to read regulations like poetry and find loopholes like hidden treasure. The ones who write the rules don't always understand them, but the ones who carve them, we read every word. If Diana wanted to play by the book, I'd show her what the book actually said. That afternoon, I parked my truck on the street and walked to the community center to request a complete copy of the HOA charter and bylaws. The clerk, a nervous-looking guy in his 20s, seemed surprised anyone actually wanted to read the whole thing. "Most people just ask about pool hours," he said, printing out what turned out to be 83 pages of legal text. I took it home and started reading like I was studying for the bar exam. It took me until midnight, but I found what I was looking for. Section 15, subsection C, recreational and commercial vehicles may not remain parked on community streets between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. except when actively engaged in permitted business activities as defined by municipal code. The key phrase was actively engaged in permitted business activities. I had a business license. I had insurance. And according to municipal code, any vehicle displaying business identification and carrying business equipment qualified for extended parking privileges. I had my weapon. Now, I just needed to aim it. The next morning, I spent 2 hours turning my boring Ford pickup into a mobile advertisement for Cole Woodworking. Magnetic signs on both doors, professionally printed with my business name and phone number. I loaded the truck bed with every piece of equipment I owned: power sanders, hand tools, wood samples, even a portable workbench. Then I parked it right in front of Diana's house and left it there all night. My hands shook locking the door. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. This was war, fought with bylaws and magnetic signs. If I lost my home. The second I stepped out, I saw her blinds twitch. The street had gone still. The letter came the next day as expected, but this time I was ready. I walked straight to Diana's front door and knocked. She answered, wearing another one of those power suits, probably on her way to terrorize some other poor homeowner. "Mr. Cole," she said, holding my latest violation notice like a weapon. "I see you've chosen to ignore our parking regulations entirely." "Actually," I said, pulling out my own folder. I'd learned to fight fire with fire. "I'm in full compliance with Section 15, subsection C. My vehicle is actively engaged in permitted business activities. I've got the municipal permits right here if you'd like to review them." I handed her copies of my business license, insurance documentation, and a highlighted copy of the municipal code that backed up my position. Watching her face as she read through the papers was like watching someone solve a puzzle they didn't know existed. Diana's composure cracked just slightly. Her jaw tightened and those manicured fingers gripped the papers a little too hard. This is highly irregular, she said, but this time her voice cracked slightly. The spirit of the regulation clearly indicates residential use only. But we both knew she was grasping at straws. I'd done my homework, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it legally. I understand your concern, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly reasonable. But I'm sure you appreciate the importance of following the letter of the law, not just the spirit. After all, that's what HOAs are for, right? Ensuring everyone follows the same rules fairly and consistently. The word fairly hit her like a slap, and I could see her calculating her next move. That night, I celebrated by grilling burgers in my backyard. My truck still parked prominently in front of her house like a neon sign spelling out checkmate. Mrs. Patterson waved from her porch and gave me a thumbs up. Even the guy across the street, who I'd barely talked to, walked over to ask about my woodworking business. Turns out half the neighborhood had been waiting for someone to stand up to Diana's reign of terror. But I should have known better than to celebrate too early. I thought that no was the end of it. I was dead wrong. Diana's retaliation started small, which should have been my first clue that something bigger was coming. A noise complaint filed against me for using a hand sander at 7:30 on a Saturday morning. Another violation notice for leaving my trash can out 30 minutes past the pickup deadline. These weren't random power plays anymore. Diana was building a case, documenting every tiny infraction like she was preparing for court. I decided to test the waters by hosting a small barbecue. Nothing crazy, just a few neighbors and my buddy Wes Turner from my old apartment complex. Wes is a construction foreman, the kind of guy who can spot trouble from 3 blocks away and isn't afraid to call it out. This Diana chick sounds like a real piece of work, he said, flipping burgers while scanning the neighboring houses. You sure you want to keep poking the bear? What's she going to do? Fine me for having friends over. I laughed, but even as I said it, something felt off. The neighborhood was too quiet for a Saturday afternoon. Usually, you'd hear kids playing, lawnmowers running, normal weekend sounds. Instead, it felt like everyone was hiding inside, waiting for something to happen. That's when I noticed the camera at the community entrance wasn't working. The little red light that usually blinked steadily was dark, and there was a handwritten out of order sign taped to the mounting post. This thing wasn't broken yesterday, Wes said, pointing to fresh scratches around the power connection. Somebody disconnected this on purpose. Around 4 o'clock, things got interesting. Diana appeared at my front gate, but this time she wasn't alone. She had 2 men with her, mid-30s, both wearing jeans and t-shirts that had seen better days. One was tall and lanky with prison tattoos crawling up his forearms. The other was shorter, but built like he spent serious time in the gym, with the kind of dead eyes that made my skin crawl. They looked about as out of place in Oakwood Hills as a motorcycle gang at a church picnic. Gavin, Diana called out, her voice tight, fake cheerful. Meet Jake and Tommy. They're new. Invite them in for a drink. Show them around. Jake leaned on the fence like he owned it, lazy and loose. But Tommy kept scanning the house like a cop casing a scene, his eyes locked on my workshop door. Thanks, but we're good here, I said, keeping the fence between us. Tommy stepped closer. Your place looks real, interesting. Be a shame if something happened to it. Silence hung heavy between us. I really think you should reconsider, Diana said, and I heard panic creeping into her voice. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming. You know that feeling when your gut screams danger? Please, Gavin, she said. They just need a look around. It's important. The way she said important sounded more like urgent, like something she couldn't afford to mess up. Wes had moved closer to where I was standing, and I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a furnace. Thanks, but we're good, I said, keeping my voice steady. Just having a quiet afternoon with family. Diana's mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something that looked like panic flash across her face. Not anger, not frustration, actual panic, like this conversation wasn't going according to some script she'd written in her head. Jake and Tommy exchanged another look, and Tommy's hand moved to his pocket in a way that made my mouth go dry. I really think you should reconsider, Diana said, her voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. But we both knew I'd already made my choice. That's when Wes leaned over and whispered something that made my blood freeze. Dude, the short one just dropped something behind that bush. Looks like cash. I glanced over and saw what he was talking about. Tommy had definitely handed something to Diana when they thought we weren't looking. Not a handshake, not a business card. Money. Diana Mallerie, queen of property values and community standards, was taking cash from two guys who looked like they belonged on a wanted poster. You know what, Diana, I said, my voice getting louder. I think we're done here. This is my property, and I decide who comes through that gate. Your friends can find somewhere else to get acquainted with the neighborhood. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Diana's face went white, then red, then something approaching purple. Tommy took a step toward the gate, and Wes moved to stand right beside me. Fine, Diana spat, all pretense of civility gone. But don't think this is over, Mr. Cole. I've tried to be reasonable with you. Tried to help you fit into this community. But if you want to be difficult, if you want to disrespect me and my guests. She paused, visibly trying to control herself. I'm calling the police. You'll regret treating me this way. As they walked away, I watched Diana pull out her phone and start dialing. Jake and Tommy didn't follow her immediately. They lingered near my fence, looking at my house like they were memorizing the layout. When they finally caught up with Diana, I heard Tommy say something that sounded like backup plan before they disappeared around the corner. She's not just trying to intimidate you, Wes muttered. She's scared. Not of us, of them. Whatever this is, she's in deeper than she planned. I stood there in my driveway, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Diana hadn't just brought sketchy friends over for a social visit. She'd brought them for a reason. And when I wouldn't let them in, she looked genuinely afraid. At the time, I thought Diana was just trying to intimidate me. I was wrong. 20 minutes later, I heard the sirens. 2 patrol cars pulled up to my house, and suddenly my quiet Saturday barbecue had turned into a neighborhood spectacle. As the sirens grew louder, I saw window blinds snapping shut like dominoes. Officer Williams, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, approached my door while his partner stayed with Diana. Mr. Cole, we received a complaint about a disturbance. Mind if we ask you a few questions? I invited them in and Wes, and I explained what had happened, the strange visitors, Diana's insistence that we let them in, the obvious discomfort we'd felt about the whole situation. So, you refuse to let these individuals onto your property? Officer Williams asked, taking notes. When I confirmed, he looked confused. Ma'am, he called over to Diana. Mr. Cole has every right to control access to his private property. I'm not sure what kind of disturbance you're reporting here. Diana started explaining how I'd been disrespectful, how I'd violated community standards by refusing hospitality to her guests. That's when Wes came running up with his phone in his hand. Gavin, you need to see this. He'd been recording on and off throughout the afternoon. The footage clearly showed Diana, Jake, and Tommy at my gate, and more importantly, it showed the money exchange that Wes had spotted earlier. Officer Williams watched the video twice, then called his partner over. Can you identify these 2 men? He asked, showing Diana the footage. The change in her expression was like watching someone realize they'd just stepped in quicksand. Those are just friends visiting the neighborhood, she stammered, but her voice had lost all its usual authority. The radio in the patrol car crackled to life, and I heard the dispatcher's voice clearly. All units, be advised. Suspects from the Elmwood burglary series spotted in the Oakwood Hills area. 2 male subjects, descriptions match. Officer Williams's partner was already walking back to their car to respond, but he stopped mid-stride when he saw Jake and Tommy walking down the street about a block away. That's them, he called out, pointing. Those are our suspects. Everything happened fast after that. The officers called for backup while keeping eyes on Jake and Tommy, who apparently realized they'd been spotted and started walking faster. Within minutes, there were 4 patrol cars in the neighborhood, and Jake and Tommy were face down on the pavement in handcuffs. Officer Williams came back to update me while his colleagues processed the arrest. Mr. Cole, I owe you an apology. Those 2 men have been wanted in connection with a string of home burglaries in this area over the past month. They've been targeting houses where they could get inside to case the layout and security systems. He paused, looking over at Diana, who was standing frozen on her front lawn. Any idea why Miss Mallerie might have been trying to get them into your house? The pieces started falling into place like dominoes. Diana's insistence that I let Jake and Tommy inside. Her panic when I refused. The cash exchange Wes had caught on video. She wasn't just being weird. She had a plan. The investigation took another hour, during which neighbors started emerging from their houses like prairie dogs after a thunderstorm. Mrs. Patterson came over and told the officers that she'd seen Diana talking to Jake and Tommy on 3 separate occasions over the past week. Another neighbor mentioned seeing Diana's car parked outside houses that had been burglarized recently, houses where she'd claimed to be conducting community wellness checks as part of her HOA duties. As they loaded Jake and Tommy into the patrol cars, Tommy shouted something at Diana that made her face go white. "You said this would be easy. You said he'd let us in." The officers heard it, too. And that was pretty much game over for Diana's story about innocent neighborhood friendship. "Mr. Cole, you may have prevented multiple burglaries tonight," Officer Williams said, handing me his card. "These guys had a whole list of targets, and your house was apparently next on their schedule." He glanced over at Diana, who was now deep in conversation with a detective. "As for Miss Mallerie, that's going to be a much longer investigation. In 2 hours, I'd gone from guy who said no to local hero. Don't ask me how. I was still figuring it out myself." But Diana wasn't the type to go down without a fight. I could see her regrouping, calculating, trying to figure out how to spin this disaster in her favor. She wasn't finished with me yet, and I had a feeling her next move was going to be desperate. By Sunday morning, Diana was in full damage control mode. I woke up to find another letter slipped under my door, but this one was different. Instead of HOA letterhead, it was written on her personal stationery, and the tone was almost apologetic. "Dear Mr. Cole, I deeply regret the misunderstanding that occurred yesterday. I had no knowledge of these individuals' criminal background and was simply trying to foster community connections." It went on for 2 pages, painting herself as an innocent victim who'd been manipulated by cunning criminals. But of course, she couldn't just leave it there. By Monday, she'd launched a full offensive campaign, and her strategy was as predictable as it was desperate. If she was going down, she was taking me with her. Officer Williams called to let me know that Diana had filed a formal complaint, claiming I was the one who brought Jake and Tommy into the neighborhood. According to her revised story, I'd been working with them all along and had only turned on them when the police showed up. "It's obviously bogus," Officer Williams assured me. "We have the video evidence, witness statements, the whole timeline. But we have to investigate any formal complaint." She wasn't just lying. She was building a cage and trying to lock me inside. By Tuesday afternoon, Diana had somehow produced official-looking documents claiming I'd violated multiple HOA regulations in connection with my alleged criminal activities. The papers looked legitimate enough: proper fonts, official seals, all the bureaucratic window dressing that Diana specialized in. But when I looked closer, something was off about the dates and signatures. I took the documents to Wes, who worked construction and dealt with permits and regulations every day. "These are fake," he said after examining them for 5 minutes. "Look at the state stamp. It's supposed to be from last month, but the ink is fresh. And this signature doesn't match the other HOA documents you showed me." That's when Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door. She looked nervous, glancing around like she was afraid of being watched. "Gavin, I need to tell you something," she said once we were inside. "I saw Diana yesterday morning right after the police left. She was in her garage with papers spread all over her car hood, and she had some kind of stamp or seal. She was making something." The next day brought a new development that made Diana's desperation crystal clear. I was working in my garage when I heard shouting from the street. Diana was standing in my driveway arguing with another neighbor, Mrs. Harris, who lived 3 houses down. "You have to support me on this," Diana was saying, her voice carrying that edge of hysteria I'd heard when her plan with Jake and Tommy fell apart. "This man is dangerous. He brought criminals into our neighborhood." Mrs. Harris didn't just shake her head. She stepped forward. "You're not taking us with you, Diana. We believed you too long. Not this time. Diana, I saw the whole thing. Those men came with you. Everyone saw it. Diana's response was to accuse Mrs. Harris of being part of some conspiracy against authority. It was painful to watch. A woman who'd once commanded respect in the neighborhood reduced to screaming at anyone who wouldn't back up her increasingly ridiculous stories. But Diana saved her biggest gun for Thursday. A detective I'd never met showed up at my door with questions about my background, my business, my relationship with the arrested burglars. "Look," Detective Morrison said, settling into my kitchen chair with a weary expression. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've seen people try to flip blame before, but this is creative." According to Diana's latest statement, I'd been operating a criminal enterprise out of my garage, using my business connections to case potential burglary targets. "Detective, I've got business records, client testimonials, tax documents, everything that proves my business is legitimate." Diana's just trying to save herself. Detective Morrison nodded. "Oh, we know. We've checked your background, your business license, everything. You're clean. And frankly, Miss Mallerie's story has more holes than Swiss cheese." That's when he told me something that made my blood run cold. "The real reason I'm here, Mr. Cole, is that we're concerned about Miss Mallerie's mental state. When people start creating this level of elaborate fiction, especially after being caught in serious criminal activity, they can become unpredictable." As Detective Morrison left, he handed me his card and offered some advice that sent chills down my spine. "Lock your doors, Mr. Cole. Install security cameras if you don't have them. People like Miss Mallerie don't usually go down quietly." Diana's last stand came exactly where I should have expected it, an emergency HOA meeting that she called for the following Saturday morning. The notice appeared in everyone's mailbox Friday evening. "Emergency session to address security concerns and criminal activity within our community." Saturday morning arrived, gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I walked into the community center expecting to find maybe a dozen neighbors and Diana holding court like some deposed queen rallying her remaining troops. Instead, I found about 30 people, nearly half the neighborhood, sitting in folding chairs arranged like a courtroom. Diana had set up a flip chart covered with what looked like a conspiracy theory connecting various neighborhood events to my alleged criminal activities. "Thank you all for coming," Diana began, her voice carrying that artificial authority I'd learned to dread. "We're here to discuss a serious threat to our community. Criminal elements that have infiltrated our neighborhood under the guise of legitimate business." She gestured to the flip chart, which I now realized was a detailed attack on me, complete with photos of my house, my truck, and what appeared to be surveillance shots of me going about my daily business. The presentation was impressive in its sheer audacity. Diana had constructed an elaborate narrative where I was the criminal mastermind who'd recruited Jake and Tommy to rob the neighborhood, using my woodworking business as a front to case houses and identify valuable targets. But here's where Diana made her critical mistake. She'd invited Harrison back to the meeting. Harrison was a retired insurance investigator who'd moved to Oakwood Hills about 5 years earlier and had served on the HOA board before Diana's election. "Excuse me, Diana," Harrison interrupted about 10 minutes into her presentation. "But I'm looking at these documents you've referenced, and I'm seeing some inconsistencies." He stood up slowly, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase. "For instance, this incident report dated last month. According to the community center's reservation log, you were in California visiting your sister that week." Diana's face went through several colors as Harrison continued. "And this witness statement from Mrs. Rodriguez about suspicious vehicles. Mrs. Rodriguez moved to Phoenix 6 months ago. He was pulling papers from his folder now, spreading them across the table like a prosecutor laying out evidence. I didn't spend 30 years chasing fraud just to let it sit in my neighborhood. This isn't oversight. This is fabrication, and I have the receipts to prove it." The room went silent. Diana stood frozen at the front, her conspiracy theory flip chart suddenly looking less like evidence and more like the ravings of someone who'd lost touch with reality. "Harrison, you don't understand the complexity of this situation," she said, but her voice had lost all its authority. That's when Harrison delivered the knockout punch. He pulled out what looked like an old book, the original HOA charter from when the neighborhood was first developed. "Actually, Diana, I helped write these bylaws 20 years ago, and there's something I don't think you've read carefully. Section 42, subsection D. In cases where an HOA president is found to have engaged in criminal activity or gross misconduct endangering community welfare, the residents may call for an immediate vote of no confidence. Mrs. Patterson stood up and addressed the room. I think we all know what happened last weekend. Diana brought criminals to Gavin's house and tried to force him to let them inside. If Gavin hadn't refused, we might all have been robbed. Mrs. Harris stood up slowly. I saw her making fake documents in her garage. I didn't want to get involved, but this isn't a neighborhood anymore. It's a battlefield. And she brought the fire. This is a witch hunt, Diana protested, but her voice was getting shrill. You're all being manipulated by a criminal who's fooled you into thinking he's innocent. Another neighbor mentioned seeing Diana meeting secretly with Jake and Tommy on multiple occasions. The weight of evidence and witness testimony was crushing, and Diana seemed to shrink with every revelation. Harrison called for the vote, and it wasn't even close. 31 residents voted for Diana's immediate removal as HOA president. 2 abstained. Diana herself was the only vote in her favor. 31 votes. Silence. Then, Mrs. Patterson started clapping. One by one, neighbors joined. Not cheers, but a slow, heavy applause. The sound of chains breaking. Diana didn't storm out. She shrank, clutching her fake evidence, and slithered away. The air tasted different. Cleaner. You'll regret this, she said, gathering her conspiracy theory materials and shoving them into a box. When your houses are burglarized, when your property values collapse, don't come crying to me. As Diana stormed out of the community center, Harrison approached me with an expression that was part sympathy, part concern. Mr. Cole, I apologize for what you've been put through. Diana's behavior has been unprecedented. We'll be holding elections for a new president next month, and I hope you'll consider participating in the process. Standing in that community center, watching my neighbors clean up after Diana's final meltdown, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Peace. The aftermath of Diana's removal moved faster than I'd expected. By Monday morning, she'd already put her house up for sale and hired a moving company. I watched from my workshop window as strangers carried boxes and furniture out of the house that had been the unofficial headquarters of neighborhood tyranny for the past 2 years. The new HOA leadership, led by Harrison Beck as interim president, immediately began rolling back Diana's most ridiculous regulations. The 37-point inspection checklist for front yard maintenance was reduced to basic upkeep guidelines. The ban on work vehicles was modified to allow reasonable parking for legitimate business purposes. Most importantly, the atmosphere of fear and constant surveillance that had defined the neighborhood under Diana's rule began to lift like morning fog. Detective Morrison called Tuesday with an update on the criminal investigation. Jake and Tommy had been charged with multiple counts of burglary and conspiracy, and they'd apparently been very talkative about their arrangement with Diana. Turns out Ms. Mallerie was getting paid $500 for every house they successfully robbed, he told me. She'd identify targets, provide access when possible, and even help them case the properties during her community wellness visits. You stopping them probably saved a dozen families from being victimized. Diana was facing charges of her own, conspiracy to commit burglary, obstruction of justice, and filing false police reports. Her lawyer is trying to work out some kind of plea deal, but with the evidence we have, including your friend's video and multiple witness statements, let's just say Ms. Mallerie is going to have plenty of time to think about her choices. Wednesday brought one of the most satisfying moments of the entire ordeal. I was installing a new security light in my workshop when little Emma Harris came running up my driveway. She was maybe 8 years old, carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen in weeks. My mom wanted me to give you this, she said, holding up what turned out to be homemade cookies. She said to tell you thank you for making the scary lady go away so she doesn't have to cut our grass every single week anymore. Emma's mother had mentioned being fined repeatedly for grass that was supposedly half an inch too tall, but hearing it from her daughter's perspective made Diana's behavior seem even more petty and cruel. The transformation of the neighborhood was remarkable. Mrs. Patterson started hosting coffee mornings on her front porch, something she'd apparently wanted to do for years, but had been afraid would violate some obscure HOA regulation about social gatherings. The family at the end of the street hung wind chimes that actually made music instead of the barely audible whispers they'd been limited to under Diana's noise ordinance. Harrison organized a community meeting to discuss positive changes and future goals. Instead of Diana's authoritarian lectures about compliance and enforcement, we had actual conversations about what people wanted from their neighborhood. Someone suggested a community garden. Another neighbor proposed organizing a tool-sharing program. The publicity from stopping a criminal conspiracy had an unexpected benefit for my business. Word spread beyond Oakwood Hills, and I started getting calls from other neighborhoods asking about custom signage, and several local businesses wanted to work with someone who'd proven they could handle difficult situations with integrity. 3 months later, I was putting the finishing touches on a new sign for the community entrance. The old one had been Diana's idea, a pretentious monument to rules and regulations that made visitors feel like they were entering a minimum security prison. The new sign was simpler, warmer, actually welcoming. Oakwood Hills, a community of neighbors, carved in oak and mounted on a stone base that Harrison and I had designed together. Mrs. Patterson stopped by as I was installing the sign, bringing her usual offering of coffee and conversation. "You know, Gavin," she said, watching me adjust the mounting brackets. "I never thought I'd see this neighborhood peaceful again." Diana had us all so afraid of each other, so focused on what we couldn't do instead of what we could build together. Standing there with my neighbors, looking at a sign that represented cooperation instead of control, I realized something important. The real victory hadn't been stopping Jake and Tommy or even removing Diana from power. The real victory was rediscovering what a community could be when people worked together instead of living in fear of arbitrary authority. The criminal case wrapped up 6 months later. Jake and Tommy each got 5 years for multiple burglary charges. Diana pleaded guilty to conspiracy and obstruction charges and received 18 months in prison plus community service. Her house sold quickly to a young family with 2 kids who immediately became some of the most popular residents in the neighborhood. Diana hid behind rulebooks and threats. We fought back with truth, receipts, and neighbors finally finding their voice. That sign Harrison and I carved, it doesn't list restrictions. It just says Oakwood Hills finally feeling like home. Remember, bullies rely on silence. Ever had a boss, a teacher, a neighbor who just loved power? Would you have let them in? Speak up. Your story might be next on HOA Unfiltered. Sometimes the hardest fights aren't loud, they're quiet, relentless, fought with paper and patience against people who think authority equals power. Diana wrapped herself in rules like armor. We used the truth like a chisel. And in the end, that was enough. Gramps used to say, "Wood doesn't lie. You just have to carve away the mess." I think I finally get it. If you're dealing with a neighborhood bully, an HOA tyrant, or anyone hiding behind the fine print to make your life harder, keep the receipts, know your rights, and speak up before someone like Diana fills the silence. You've been watching HOA Unfiltered. Drop your story in the comments if you've ever taken on a power tripper with a clipboard. And hey, if you've stuck with me this far, you know what to do. Thanks for watching.